Hi, this is Phil Klein. Welcome back to First Principles, where freedom is not complicated, but unfortunately, in today's America, it's becoming so. Today, I have the honor and opportunity to discuss election integrity with a dear friend of mine, somebody I've come to know over the past several months as we've worked together on the Amistad Project relating to election integrity. Tom King, he's a fellow in the National Trial Lawyers Association. He is one of they call him super lawyers in Pennsylvania, and believe me, he is. He is in Pittsburgh. He handled all of our Pennsylvania litigation during this past election cycle, and also has been a key advisor to all of our national efforts, which are still going on with the Amistad Project. He's a graduate of the University of Virginia and additionally of Dickinson Law School. Tom, wonderful to see you, buddy. Great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you, Phil. I'm always honored to be with you, and thanks for the kind words and the introduction. And I must say that it's been a real privilege for me and my firm to be associated with you and the Amistad Project and the Thomas More Society. I can't tell you how honored we are to be part of an outstanding group of people.
Well, thanks for what you're doing. Now, Tom, you and I go back a little ways. And I just want to ask you this, speaking from our generation to the generations that have followed, what is concerning about what's happening in America today to you?
Well, a number of things, and of course, as we sit here today, the debacle that's happening in the Middle East is so disconcerting to the whole country. It's a national shame. But looking at election integrity, all of this goes back. You know what's happening there. Everything goes back to election integrity, because as the founders, as you know, created this nation. And I had the privilege of being in the Third Circuit in Philadelphia, steps away from where the Constitution was crafted, and arguing constitutional issues on behalf of the Amistad Project, literally in Liberty Bell Square, Independence Square in Philadelphia. And so as we look at the election issues and election integrity, it's almost like in the beginning in England when the sheriff rode out to serve a writ. People knew that there was integrity to the process because the sheriff served the writ in England, and so if the sheriff brought it, it had to be so. And so in our elections, when it gets to the U.S. Senate or Congress or even school board or township commissioner, if there are questions about the integrity of the process and how it's been handled, then the people who hold the mantles and the honor of serving in those positions do so under a cloud, because if we can't trust how the elections are being conducted, then how is it that we can trust what it is that those who govern us are doing?
Well, let me ask you this, and I'm going to challenge you here, and you know what my thoughts are on this, and we have faced some of this ourselves. But what do you say to those? And I've got two questions, Tom. I'm going to play a little bit of journalist here. What do you say to those who say just by raising the questions, you're undermining faith in the election process and harming the process? And secondly, if we shouldn't we have faith right now? And if not, why not? So if you go to the first one, what do you respond? You know, our critics, and they're coming after you as well. How do you respond to them?
I would respond to them by saying that it's so important. This is such an essential foundation of a democracy that, and we have the right to question these things and to make sure that they're accurate. And the great part about being associated with the Amistad Project and with yourself, Phil, is that we're about this in a right way. We want to do this to make sure that the systems work, and we want to make sure that there's integrity in the systems and the way that things are done. And how people ultimately decide to vote is up to them. That's why we have a free nation. And whether they're Republican or whether they're Democrat or they're independent is entirely up to the majority of the people casting votes. But if there's no integrity in the system, and if there are questions about how it's conducted, and so then there's a problem with the entire system. And so when you go back to the last election in 2020, and even before that, and I've told you, and you know that I was involved in the Megan McCarthy King campaign, which is an appellate judge related to me in Pennsylvania, and I was in Philadelphia in the counting room, and arguing about how they do things in Philadelphia. And I knew in 2019 that there were going to be massive problems in 2020 because of what was going on in Philadelphia at the time. So the answer to the question is that not only do we have every right, but I think we have every responsibility to raise legitimate questions and issues about how elections are being conducted. We have a right to know after the fact that they were fairly conducted, and that the people who are elected were properly elected. So I just think
let me ask you, as a Pennsylvanian, do you have faith in the result of the 2020 presidential election?
Here's my answer to that. The answer is that the jury is still out on things that happened in Pennsylvania. And one of those things that happened in Pennsylvania, of course, was the story of the truck driver who the Amistad Project was directly involved with. There is still an ongoing investigation into his affidavit and his statement that he transported to over 200,000 ballots into Pennsylvania from a
completed ballots.
Yeah, a completed ballots from a facility in New York state that's not supposed to receive things like that, and he transported them into Pennsylvania. And as you and I know, and I think it's widely known, this isn't something that we cooked up. This is something that we reported to the United States attorneys in Pennsylvania, and we dealt with the FBI, and we dealt with postal authorities, and there still is no conclusion to that story. And so, in terms of having faith, I trust the election people in my precinct, and I trust the people in my county who participated. I don't know what happened everywhere. I do know some things that were very disturbing in Pennsylvania. I know that there were and it's appearances a lot of times that lead people to be skeptical of the conclusions that are reached. And so we do know that in Philadelphia, for example, people were kept great distances from the counting rooms. We know that people were excluded from the counting rooms. We know against the law. In my opinion, it is. And we know that at one point, the Commonwealth Court in Pennsylvania issued an order, an injunction ordering the people in Philadelphia to allow the Republican ballot watchers to have access to get within 6 feet of the ballots, and that the election officials in Philadelphia refused to honor that order and said that we're not going to honor that order because it's going to be appealed to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And ultimately it was, and it was reversed. But when the order was in effect, they refused to honor it anyway. And that's from a statewide court in Pennsylvania. Yeah. We also know, and the Amistad Project was deeply involved, and you and I were involved on election night. I was calling you from Pennsylvania election night to tell you that the people who were following the chain of custody of the drop boxes in Delaware County were not only being threatened by the police because they were following the people who had the ballots, but I had to actually speak directly to some local police officers out there and tell them that if they persisted in interfering with these people, that we would end up in federal court over that as a violation of their civil rights. So those are the kind of things were going on. We had an injunction action in Delaware County. There were threats made by the district attorney of Philadelphia County against a TV station. I think it was the ABC affiliate in Philadelphia, and other people from the Republican Party who were watching the drop boxes. One of which showed video of the drop box where Mayor Kenny of Philadelphia shows up with multiple ballots and tries to put multiple ballots in the drop box. And multiple meaning two, but you're only allowed to drop one in Pennsylvania. You're not allowed to possess somebody else's ballot.
And this is from the people who promised that they would have these drop boxes under 24-hour surveillance. And so when anybody wants to view whether multiple ballots are being dropped in the drop box, they get threatened with arrest. I'm going to come back to Jesse Morgan here in a little bit because I think our viewers will want an update on that. But I want to ask you this. You were talking about the intimidation of the left, or the intimidation against those who ask questions. Do you believe that there's a coordinated campaign to try to frighten and chill legitimate efforts to look into the 2020 election?
I think there is a coordinated campaign by certain people to intimidate those who would question anything that has to do with the 2020 election, and to make those of us who do that look as though we are insurrectionists in some way. And so people like you and I have been around too long to be intimidated by that, and I'm not going to be intimidated by it. And so we're still prepared to go forward and fight the good fight. And by a fight, I don't mean that we're looking to pick a fight. We're looking to get to a conclusion. And if the conclusion is that everything was fine, I'll be the first to stand up and say that. And if the conclusion is that everything wasn't fine, I'll be right by your side as we say what wasn't fine about it. And so there were things that weren't fine about it. There were rules changed at the last moments. In Pennsylvania, we know that at 9:30 at night, the night before the election, the Secretary of the Commonwealth was sending out directives that were nowhere to be found in the rules of the game up to that point. And you know, when you see a directive come out 9:30 at night before Election Day, saying that it's okay to cure ballots, that's not even a term we knew about. In 2019. We didn't have ballot curing. We never heard of it.
Well, and let me share with the listeners and viewers what that means. It means that a ballot comes in that the law says should not be counted. Yeah. Because there's a flaw, doesn't have enough information, wasn't signed. And instead of not counting that ballot, in the urban core, they fixed it.
Yeah.
And they counted it. By fixing it, it doesn't mean that they verified it was the actual voter. It means they just did something so that they would count the vote.
Well, here are two things I want to say about that. And you know this because thanks to the people who support the Amistad Project, we know, and we have photographs of what they did in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. They put a table outside the Election Bureau office, and they literally threw, it's a mess how they did it. They threw all the ballots that needed to be cured or needed to be fixed. And when I say ballots, they're in an envelope, so they weren't open to the ballot yet. But they put all the ones out on a table out in the hall. We have pictures of people walking by it. That's not election integrity. And then they called the representatives of the Democratic Party of Montgomery County. And later, when we raised Cain about all this, then they supposedly notified the Republicans as well. But they called the Democratic Committee to let them know that they could come down and root through these ballots, figure out who had faulty ballots, and allow those people to come in and fix whatever the problem was.
Purportedly the same people.
Well, supposedly, I don't know who came. I don't think anybody knows who came.
Right.
And unless there's a video from the courthouse somehow. So how does that comport with an election that supposedly has integrity to it? And so we know that happened. We also know this carried on into the 2021 election. And in 2021, the year after the Trump election, in the primary this past year, we had very important issues on the ballot in the primary election.
Now this is March or?
This was June or May, I'm sorry. This was May of 2021, just a few months ago. We had two constitutional amendments on the ballot to rein in the power of the tyrant Tom Wolf, the governor of Pennsylvania. And so we had these two important issues on the ballot. And so in Philadelphia, and they had done this back to 2019 when I told you I was there with the Megan McCarthy King campaign. In 2019, they were counting ballots or counting envelopes which have the ballots in them when they didn't have signatures, and they were also counting them when they didn't have dates. And I stood up there in the warehouse in Philadelphia in front of 3 election judges and said, "This is wrong. 66 counties in Pennsylvania do not count these ballots, and Philadelphia does. That's not right. It's against the law." The woman there representing the Pennsylvania Democratic Party stood up and said, "Oh yes, every vote should count." And I said, "Listen, we think every vote should count. Every vote that should be counted should get counted, not just every vote that somebody tossed into a bucket somewhere." So in any event, in 2019, they counted them. Again in 2021, after the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had ruled that the envelopes must be dated. So the Supreme Court ruled that in a number of respects, things we didn't like, but in this respect, they had to be dated. And so the election commissioners in Philadelphia, there are three of them, one Republican and two Democrats, voted unanimously. All three voted to count, I think it was about 12 or 1,300 votes. And remember, these constitutional amendments are extremely important, critically important. Most of the votes in Philadelphia are going to be against reining in the power of the governor. So they want to count as many votes as they can down there. So they get 1,300 ballots and they count them. And they take a vote, and it's 3-0 to count them. And so the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Pennsylvania and the President pro tem of the Senate of Pennsylvania, to their great credit, I give them great credit for this. They just said, enough is enough. We are not going, here's what we're going to do. If you continue to persist in counting those ballots, we are going to begin impeachment proceedings on all three of you. And we're going to impeach the three election commissioners in Philadelphia County. And so suddenly, as a result of that letter from the Speaker and the President pro tem, another vote was taken. And believe it or not, the vote was 2-1 not to count them. But I couldn't believe that anybody would vote against that. And so there was still one of the Democratic election commissioners still voted to count them on this theory that they have, on this thing that they keep saying everywhere, that Republicans are suppressing the vote if they question any part of this, that it's an attempt to suppress the vote. That's no attempt to suppress the vote. That's an attempt to play the game by the rules and to follow the rules that were set down by the Supreme Court.
There got to be rules. And I think most of America understands that, but possibly not. I mean, imagine you're playing a game of baseball and one team gets up to bat and they get a single and then they don't advance. And the other team gets up and gets a hit out to first or out into the outfield. They run to third, come back and score. And no, don't go to first base. And they're saying, no, we ought to count that because look, he did pretty much what is necessary, put the ball in play. So let's count it as a run. That's how this election was run, unfortunately.
Well, and what you're describing actually sounds to me, unfortunately, like the Pittsburgh Pirates of today.
They need that kind of help. They need that kind of help.
As a lifelong Pirates fan, it pains me to say that, Phil, because I know you're going to throw the Kansas City Royals in.
Well, we're hurting too. We're hurting too. But I would say, and baseball should be hurting with their wokeness. I'm disappointed in their so-called wokeness. But I would say this, Tom, I believe, and I'm interested if you agree, this is one of the most lawless elections in U.S. history. And what I mean by that is that in these blue state urban core strongholds, they made up their own rules. And the rest of the areas of these core state or these swing states followed the law while they made up the rules in the urban core. That's what I believe we're seeing. Would you generally agree with that?
I would tell you, for example, when I was involved in the case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. So all of a sudden we had a decision from our Supreme Court in Pennsylvania. And that decision was to extend the election out by 3 days so that you could receive mail-in ballots 3 days after they were due. We have had a law in Pennsylvania forever and a day that the ballots, even if you're voting properly absentee, and I'm not just talking about mail-in, but traditionally the absentee ballots, they had to be received in the voting office by 8 o'clock on the night of the election. That was it. If they came the next day, they were too late. And so you had to follow the rules. And so all of a sudden the Supreme Court said, because they completely ignored the findings, they appointed a master, and the master gave them a report. The master was a Republican judge from the Commonwealth Court, made a report to the Supreme Court and said, the mail service is reliable. It will work. It does. They don't need to extend this data. Nonetheless, the court voted, I believe, 5-2. We have 5 Democrats, 2 Republicans. The vote was 5-2 to extend the election out by 3 days. That case was appealed to the United States Supreme Court from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And in the United States Supreme Court, when that case was taken up, and Justice Alito is the justice who covers Pennsylvania for the Supreme Court. Justice Alito reported that case to the Supreme Court. a vote was taken, and the vote was 4-4. The Chief Justice voted with the 3 liberal justices, and so they did not agree to stop that order. It was on a stay. Subsequent to that same case, but however, and I will tell you that there were opinions written at that time, and the opinions written by Alito and Kavanaugh and others spoke specifically to what happened in Pennsylvania. And there was actually an opinion written that said that it looked like, I'm paraphrasing this, but it looked like the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania had exceeded its authority in extending out these 3 days. And so ultimately, when Justice Coney Barrett came on the court, another vote was taken, and regrettably, the vote at that time was 6-3. It was after the insurrection and everything that took place at the Capitol, and so the vote was 6-3, and they agreed. And of course, at that point, the margin was about 80,000 votes in favor of President Biden. And there were, I think, about 10,000 votes that were at issue in this extension. But the principle was that the extension was not proper. And so what you had is you had Alito and others saying, listen, this case is here, whether it's 10,000 votes, it's 2,000 votes, or it's 20,000 votes. The case is here, and it ought to be decided, and it should have been decided. And then we would have known whether it was correct or not. And so
yeah, we're going to see it again.
If it happens again, or when it happens again in Pennsylvania, it'll be back up. And that was the point that I think Clarence Thomas actually made that point. That's the point that Justice Thomas made, was why don't we deal with this now? And then people in Pennsylvania will know. And so,
well, in Kansas, we call it hiding in the tall grass.
Yeah.
And the court ran to the tall grass and hid, using issues such as standing and things like that to avoid the real question, and really pointing the finger at the state legislature and their responsibility under the Constitution to select presidential electors. But I do believe, and I want to summarize something that I know you agree with, that we have found in our investigation and litigation, and that is that there was a 2-tier election system. And one tier was operated with private nonprofit monies that dictated the operation of the election offices in the urban core to benefit one candidate, Mr. Biden, and turn out the vote. And then there was the other tier where they used COVID fear, and they actually, in many ways, suppressed the vote in blue state areas and Republican areas through shutdowns and so forth. I want to switch, and we've got a few minutes left, to our profession, the profession of law, which has a very, very storied history of a willingness to stand up for the individual liberty and freedoms of people whom the lawyer might disagree with. And I've always believed, Tom, that a free nation can't remain free unless its people is willing to stand for the freedoms of those with whom they disagree. And I'm concerned we're losing that. And our profession, unfortunately, I believe, is leading the way with the weaponization of ethics. And you've served on the Supreme Court disciplinary board. You have an understanding as it relates to professional ethics and what they mean. Do you have concerns about using ethics and the administrative state and other professions and trades as weapons against political enemies?
I have great concerns about that. And I think that weaponizing the disciplinary board and other and even the courts in Washington, D.C. have gotten involved, and in Minnesota. And so coming after the lawyers for putting forth what may be novel or unique arguments, if you look back at Brown versus Board of Education, that was a unique and novel argument that led to a monumental decision in the United States Supreme Court that separate but equal was no longer the law of the land. And Dred Scott and all of those decisions that were in place at various times, some lawyer somewhere stood up. John Adams stood up and represented the redcoats, right?
In the Boston Massacre.
That's right,
yes.
and got them acquitted, right? And
yeah, a couple of them.
Yeah, so I don't know what they did after that, but but Adams was roundly criticized for representing.
And then he became president.
He did, and
yes.
And so that's one example, and there are lots of lawyers who have the courage And, you know, God willing, we'd all have the courage that you've had in your career and the things that you've stood up for and that you still stand up for. And so you're sort of a beacon to the rest of us to say this is how somebody should comport themselves. We went to law school for a reason. We went because we believed in the foundations of this country and that people ought to be represented. And that sometimes we represent things that are popular and sometimes we represent things that are unpopular. And that we try to do the best we can do to do right by the Constitution. We all take an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. And so when we bring actions that are novel, and when we bring things that are unique, if there's this tremendous chill over the nation, which there is currently, and when the people on the left, for example, are going to take on every lawyer on the right who has any questions whatsoever about the election or about the integrity of the election, then there's a chill on all of us. And so if that can happen to Republican lawyers today, it can happen to Democrat lawyers tomorrow, and it can happen to people representing, for example, in the Innocence Project. You have lots of people, you know, the Innocence Project has proven in a number of instances that people didn't commit a crime. And so those people are the people that undertake those cases are under tremendous pressure. The families are upset, the prosecutors are upset, the police are upset, and sometimes they prove that something didn't happen. And so if you chill the system and you go after the lawyers and you stop any inquiries being made, that's not the American system and that's not America. And so we need to all stand up and say that that's not right.
You know, many people don't realize that the famous quote from Shakespeare, the first thing you do is kill all the lawyers,
Yeah.
was really speaking about that's what you must do to have revolution, because the lawyers are the ones who protect individual liberty. And if you're going to create a dictatorship or an authoritarian government, you have to get rid of the lawyers who might disagree that the government ought to have that power. And I'm afraid that the profession is not only standing on the sidelines to a certain extent, it's participating in an erosion of our profession from that key role, and that is defending the freedom of liberty of people who we disagree with and people who may be unpopular. And that's more so what this is about, Tom, I'm afraid, than anything else. They hate Trump, so anybody who stands up and arguably has something, even if it's not Trump as their client, that is a Trump position, they're attacking.
Yeah.
And
we've seen it in you know, we've seen it time and again. I mean, it's ongoing. And so you
it's
know,
un-American.
It's up to people like you, who we look up to, and I look up to, and me, to do what's right.
Tom, thank you so much for what you're doing. I know you're going to stay on the battlefield. It's an honor to stand next to you, buddy. And it's so wonderful to be able to stand next to somebody who I know is not going to flee as the slings and arrows come flying by, but might even step in front of me now and then. So thanks, buddy. I appreciate it.
I'd be honored to do that anytime. So,
no,
thanks for having me.
I wouldn't ask you to.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for all your leadership, and
thank you very much.
And this effort. And to our listeners, I just say it's extraordinary the time that we live in, when there is a belief that instead of believing that ideas are not equal, in other words, there are good ideas, there are bad ideas, there are ideas that promote justice, ideas that promote injustice, and we must not tolerate unjust ideas. We must speak out against it. Instead, we're being taught that no. Certain ideas coming out of government are the only ideas to consider, and people are the problem. So in other words, we cancel people. We don't cancel ideas, we're canceling people. We're saying that certain people who are members of certain groups or take certain positions no longer have the rights that you and I share, no longer have the opportunity to speak about their concerns, are people that we must cancel from our culture. That is so contrary to freedom and liberty and the American experiment that it's hard to even articulate. No, it's people that are created by a higher moral authority than government, God Almighty, that are to be treated equally and have equal rights that all of us must cherish and protect, even to the point that we support the speech of people, the free speech of people, not the ideas behind it, of people who may even offend us. And if we lose that ability and instead use the power of government to attack those with whom we disagree in speech and in thought, well, we're a part of the problem. We're part of the problem. We need all of those who love individual liberty and freedom, all of those who love our Bill of Rights, to join together, whether Republican or Democrat, to defeat what is happening in America, which is giving government jurisdiction over thought and speech and over every aspect of our life. I'm Phill Klein. Thank you for joining us on First Principles.